Thank you all for coming along this evening, and it's a huge pleasure to have Professor Ian Parker, are you Emeritus Professor now? Or Emeritus Professor Ian Parker along this evening. Ian has had an illustrious career in and out of and against psychology, is that reasonable? And beyond that, as a psychoanalytic practitioner and political activist. Is that career or is that just life?
Yeah, the three parts of my life, I guess. Yeah.
And Ian has, as you probably all gathered from the publicity for this event, has recently published this fantastic little book. I say little because he's just told me that the next book is much bigger than this, so this is the little version. The big one, which sounds quite juicy, is coming in the new year?
March. That's about psychology.
Yeah. So we've asked Ian to come along tonight to talk about this. We thought rather than doing the usual Lacan in Scotland thing where we have someone present a paper and then audience questions afterwards, we thought as the paper is a book, we're not going to get Ian to read the book to you, but we thought we'd do a kind of interview, conversation. So I'm going to chat with Ian, and then at a kind of natural point we'll open things up to the audience for people to ask questions. And it's a small enough group of us here that if you have burning questions you want to ask, then just jump in or stick your hand up or something. And as the conversation unfolds, if there's things you want to pick up on, there's no reason why not. Okay. So I'm going to start with the obvious question. Why this book, and why this book at this point?
This is what you say to someone who comes into analysis, isn't it? Why now? That you've had things which have been niggling away at you, that you haven't been able to make sense of, a kind of symptom, and you kind of lived well enough up to now, and then it comes to a breaking point, and you have to do something with it. And I suppose that's the point that I got to. I wanted to speak about psychoanalysis in a way that addressed some of the questions that I've been worrying over as I tried to keep away from psychoanalysis and then got drawn into it, and then trained as a psychoanalyst, and then met psychoanalysts from different parts of the world, from different traditions of psychoanalysis. I wanted to address some of those questions that I've been worrying away at, and to do it in a way that connected my own struggle with the struggle that I can see other people having as they encounter psychoanalysis, and as I've tried to explain to them why I got into it so deeply, why I didn't keep away from it because I was so hostile to it at the beginning. And what I find so intriguing about all of the kind of intrigues and machinations and problems that there are in the psychoanalytic organizations. Because one of the problems that we face, which is a big problem, is that you would expect that psychoanalysts, having been through analysis themselves, would come out at the end and be perfectly clarified, saintly creatures that would be able to interact with each other in a civilized way, and the organizations that they set up would be nice, friendly organizations where we have theoretical debates that would eventually arrive at the perfect idea of what psychoanalysis should be in its theory and practice, whereas in fact the psychoanalytic organizations are at least as bad as other organisations that I've been part of, and in some ways worse. There's some kind of pathology that runs through these organisations, and I wanted to display that and think about it, as well as think about the theoretical and practical issues. So it's a kind of, in a way, it's an introduction to psychoanalysis, but it's the kind of introduction to psychoanalysis that I wish that I'd had when I'd started it. So I guess that's what immediately impelled me to write it.
Okay. There's a number of interesting points in there I want to pick up on, but just to stay with the book and the germination of the book itself for a minute. The book has a strong autobiographical stream to it, which is unusual for your work. I mean, most of your work puts the argument very much up the front, and there are a lot of arguments in here, but it's very evident from the beginning and the title and then the text itself that this is a different kind of book, in the sense that you're putting yourself into the book rather than sitting behind the book. What informed that choice, and was that a difficult choice?
Yeah, I mean, the title is not what I wanted. The title is more anodyne than I had in mind.
What was the real title?
The working title, when I was nearly got to the end of it, was Psychoanalysis Isn't What You Think. To convey something of the way that people have all kinds of misapprehensions about what psychoanalysis is, misunderstandings of psychoanalysis, but also that psychoanalysis isn't about thinking, it's about all of the other stuff that goes on, that surrounds thinking and frames it and that escapes thinking. So that's what I was working with, but Routledge eventually thought it was a bit too cryptic. And someone complained that the title has this kind of three-part thing, psychoanalysis, clinic context. It's a bit like uber trendy, enigmatic restaurant menu, someone said, like miso, yuzu, samphire. But it's worse than that, because it's a bit bland, and I don't think it really conveys what you've just drawn attention to, which is that it's a personal account as well as a theoretical account, and I wanted to speak about the ideas, but I wanted to embed myself in the ideas, because it seems to me that psychoanalysis as a practice is some kind of autobiographical enterprise, but I betray psychoanalysis in the book, actually, as I write it, because psychoanalysis in practice is a kind of anti-autobiographical enterprise in the way that it deconstructs the convenient narrative that we have that keep our lives together, and that we rehearse every time we meet someone new. A banal, cliche narrative of where I went to school and what I think or what I like. What I love, and instead psychoanalysis dismantles those kind of stories that we tell ourselves, and really in the end I suppose shows us that those narratives are rubbish. They do the work of giving us a kind of lattice work through which we can make sense of our relationships with others, but they're really quite nonsensical. And they do more harm than good most of the time. But I wanted to convey something of that kind of personal enmeshment that there is in psychoanalysis. That we go into psychoanalysis speaking about ourselves. We're in an intimate relationship with another person, usually one-to-one, could be in a group analysis I talk about in the book as well, because that's something I flirted with along the way. And the analyst themselves is enmeshed in the personal world of the patient, analysand, as we say, in the personal world of the analysand. So you I wanted to speak about that as well, to show how we're enmeshed in that.
So you have to put yourself.
You have to put yourself in some way or another. I mean, if I'd done it in a real kind of cut up, deconstructed subject kind of way, it would have been unreadable. So I had to have a narrative. That's my excuse. Yeah. It does make sense. Again, just to reassure you, if you haven't read the book, it does make sense.
I can vouch for it. Yes, it does make sense. And in that kind of strong state, it makes sense. It seems to me in reading it, there's very careful choices being made. So it is making a sense, rather than simply being a stream of consciousness.
Yes. Well, I remember.
Get it all down.
Yeah, I remember being in a seminar of the London Society of the New Lacanian School some years ago when I was training, and some analysts who'd come over from Paris to give us the good news, was speaking, and someone in the audience said, I just don't get it, it doesn't make sense. And he said, good, it's not supposed to make sense. And that was a light bulb moment for me, actually. But what does that mean? How can you work with a system of thought that doesn't make sense, but you have to be led along into it in a way that makes sense for you to be able to have some anchor points, some compass points to know where you are in the field? That's what I tried to...
I mean, there's a sense from many Lacanians that it's a betrayal of Lacan or the Lacanian field to make sense of it.
Yes, but every psychoanalyst, and this is why the autobiographical element is so key to the book. Every psychoanalyst has to make sense as they trace their own trajectory through this bewildering, contradictory series of theories that you find in psychoanalysis and that you find in Lacan. And although the psychoanalytic schools group people together who have some kind of agreement about what the key issues are, big differences between the different psychoanalytic schools, but inside the schools there's kind of a pretense of agreement. Actually, even inside each of the schools, each of the psychoanalysts has their own idiosyncratic understanding of what Lacan is saying. And I think that's right. That's as it should be. If we're aiming in psychoanalysis for the singularity of the subject, then we have to also reflect back on the singularity of the analyst as someone who has a particular way of grasping what psychoanalysis is for them.
Okay. I'll come back to some of those ideas. Before that, you mentioned earlier, Stephen, this constitutes quite a significant part of the book, your resistance to psychoanalysis.
Yeah.
And just for the sake of the audience, who I'm guessing most people haven't read the book yet, can you give us a kind of a prescient version of that resistance? What is it that put you off psychoanalysis initially?
Well, one is the pretty crap way that psychoanalytic people tend to reduce explanation to the level of the individual. So it does seem as if political, social, symbolic factors, structural issues are less important than what goes on for an individual and inside an individual. For most psychoanalysts, it's inside an individual, buried away in their unconscious, and the way that they repeat childhood patterns of relating to significant others through the rest of their lives, so that you end up with a reductive understanding of politics and of social questions, cultural questions. You end up with this reductive understanding, which also at the same time smuggles in an essentialist account of what human being is, so that we're all driven by certain kind of impulses, and these can be detected in some kind of psychoanalytic interpretation of individuals' speech. That's one problem, and embedded in that problem of individualism in psychoanalysis, which is a problem, but that's something that really put me off it. That reductive approach of psychoanalysts was the reduction to sex, to a particular idea of what sex is as the bedrock of what it is to be a human subject, and a particular idea of what that sex is, which is basically a cobbling together of stereotypical ideas of what men and women are and what men and women want. and the way they should fit together. And every man should find a woman, and every man should find a man, and the men who don't, there's a problem with them, women who don't, there's a problem with them, and you end up in this chopping down into a normalised subject. Not only is it individualised, but it's normalised. It's normalised around sex and sexuality. So that's the second issue, and then something that you particularly find in the discipline of psychology, and I come through the discipline of psychology, is that there's a pretense on the part of psychoanalysts that psychoanalysis is scientific, but scientific in a certain kind of way, which means that it sets itself up. If you adopt that narrative, that scientific narrative, it sets itself up to fail every test that the psychologists will put in its way, absolutely in a ridiculous way. You can't win once you try to get over those empiricist, positivist hurdles that psychology sets up for psychoanalysis, and many psychoanalysts have fallen into that trap. So there's the scientism of psychoanalysis that is a problem, and against that, and at the same time, I think the fourth problem is the cultishness of psychoanalysis. The way that people who get into psychoanalysis seem to lose their marbles, so that they were once critical, skeptical, using ideas to dismantle subjectivity, and they end up being evangelists for a kind of worldview which they then want to propagate and insist upon, and insist that their account of sex and sexuality, their account of the individual, their claim to it being science is all good, and that anyone who doesn't agree with it is in some way damaged, that they can't get it. It's an old trick in psychoanalysis that you turn psychoanalytic categories against those who criticize it as a practice. And good. I will, and I finish this sentence. That's good. Thanks. Starting to interrupt. That they will. That they'll turn it against the critics, and that's what kept me away from it as well. Especially again, I deal briefly with psychology in the book just because it's there in my background. Particularly so-called critical psychologists who then become caught up in psychoanalysis and then evangelists for psychoanalysis as a kind of psychology. So that really kept me away from it for a long time. So
the critical psychologists who become uncritical psychoanalysts.
Exactly. Okay. So
I've got a question.
Yeah.
Have you actually have any hypothesis about why that's happening, that they become so close in a way and so protective over this psychoanalytical approach?
That's a very good question, and I think it's partly to do with the marginal place of psychoanalysis in relation to the culture around it. It's true that psychoanalytic ideas spread through kind of globalized, psychologized culture, but also at the same time, psychoanalysts in their practice are always marginalized and pointed at as being the ones who have crazy ideas and do bad things to people in the clinic and don't believe that people have been abused and all this kind of thing. These kind of accusations needle away at them, and that might be one reason why the psychoanalysts, when they get together, take on some kind of bizarre victim status and close things around them. I think that might be one reason it happens. And another reason, which is part of that, is like, where Marx says somewhere, the sectarianism in the left increases as the real movement gets weaker. That as psychoanalysis becomes beleaguered, people cluster into their own little cells, their own kind of specialist, which gives them the touchstone of the truth, against the enemies who betrayed it. You know, okay, I've been complaining about the positivists, and you know, I have plenty of psychoanalysts in my sights in the book as well. But it is an endemic problem that psychoanalysts will find enemies among themselves all the time.
Narcissism, a small difference.
Oh, yes, there's that. There's that, yes.
Is it? You're talking. We've been using the term psychoanalysis here as if it's one thing.
Yeah.
Is that a fair way to use the term now? When there are, you know, they're not simply. You know, I mean, I use the term narcissism with small differences slightly ironically because it's such a cliche to use, but you know, is it really small differences, or actually are there huge differences? And you know that Lacanian psychoanalysis is not the same thing as object relations theory, and to put them all under the banner of a single thing creates a unity where there is actually very little unity.
Yeah. Well, you know, this is where I kind of like, okay, I think of myself as a Marxist, but this is where I really am a liberal pluralist. Is that I think that these things are psychoanalysis. To be honest, I think that object relations theory, Kleinian theory, group analysis, even very, very tentatively, with my fingers crossed, would say Jungian analytical psychology. Some of the practitioners have come very close enough, I would say, to psychoanalysis today to be included in this, what Freud called mad horde, the mad horde. Anyone who's part of our mad horde is a psychoanalyst. That yes, there are these big differences and little differences, but it's a very varied field. And if you were to go down and home in on one of the subsections, which is I eventually arrive at Lacan, of course, in the book, yeah. But even when you go and home in on one of the subsections of psychoanalysis and declare it to be the real psychoanalysis, you find that there are these huge differences there as well. Yeah. So it's I'd be very generous in my use of the term psychoanalysis and wary about accusing people too quickly of being not really psychoanalysts, because we pure Lacanians fall into many of the traps ourselves. Yeah, it would just rebound against us, I think, if we were to do that. We'd end up in a kind of a group of one against you. You know, there's this reminds me actually. One of the things that attracted me to the psychoanalytic organisations as well as to the theory is that I recognised something very quickly about the way that they operated. And there's an old joke that psychoanalysts, particularly Lacanians, are very like Trotskyists. You know, like you have one Trotskyist, you have two Trotskyists, and you have a party, group. You have three Trotskyists and you have an international. You have four Trotskyists and you have a split. You recognise this world in Lacanian psychoanalysis. You have this grouping together, and then this fragmentation, this splitting, and this recrimination against those who don't agree with you.
They go against the orthodoxy, yeah.
Yes, but what is an orthodoxy?
Well, that was going to be my question.
Issue, isn't it?
Can you be an orthodox Lacanian?
What could there be as orthodoxy in psychoanalysis if you're concerned with the singularity of the subject, and you're concerned with the cultural, different cultural contexts which have allowed psychoanalysis to flourish, and you are attending to the way that psychoanalysis in each of those cultural contexts goes against the grain and is critical of the dominant culture, and you have the historical unfolding of different kinds of relationships, family relationships, social relationships, use of language, and so on and so forth, which means that there's a a developing of the contradictions and appearance of new forms of subjectivity that Freud could never have anticipated. You have all of those things, and then what? There cannot be orthodoxy, can there? Orthodoxy must be antithetical to psychoanalysis.
Yeah, and yet many psychoanalysts see themselves as somehow representing the orthodox.
Yes. Yeah. Well, there's a book a few years ago edited by Anne Casement called Who Owns Psychoanalysis, which had contributions from different psychoanalytic traditions, particularly spurred on by the attempt to regulate psychoanalysis and to say how it should be practiced and how they should be trained and how there should be standards recognizable so that people know what psychoanalysis is. Actually, Anne Casement managed to get a number of different psychoanalysts from different traditions to work with that idea. Who owns psychoanalysis? Well, no one owns psychoanalysis. It's a disparate practice.
So within that disparate practice, you landed in the Lacanian field, or you have been identified as a Lacanian, or you identified yourself?
I am a Lacanian. I wouldn't say it as an identity statement because we don't like identities, you know.
No, but you have been identified.
I'm a Lacanian.
People would describe you in that way.
Yes. Yeah.
Why Lacan, given all the other versions of psychoanalysis and even versions of therapy? Why Lacan?
Because Lacan helps us to open up some of those problems that I identified at the beginning of the book, those 4 problems about scientism and reductionism and normative sexuality and cultishness, not so much, okay, but opens up a number of those problems and has a quite interesting tack on those as he develops his own reading of Freud, what he calls return to Freud, return to the meaning of Freud, his detailed excavation of Freudian concepts that have been forgotten by the psychoanalysts working in the International Psychoanalytical Association, where the International Psychoanalytical Association was the worldwide organization that was set up by Freud and his followers in 1910. So it's very important as a kind of sedimentation of institutionally of what psychoanalysis is. But Lacan rebelled against the orthodoxy of the International Psychoanalytical Association and reminded, a very series of seminars, other writings, reminded psychoanalysts that there were concepts there that needed to be retrieved, one of which being Nachträglichkeit, afterwardsness. That it takes 2 traumas to take a trauma kind of idea, that what we experience as traumatic in our childhood is something that is activated or made traumatic by a later event. It's something which is after the event, always in psychoanalysis. And theoretically, conceptually, historically, you can see Lacan working with that as well. There's something in Lacanian psychoanalysis that goes back to those kind of gritty, contradictory moments at the core of psychoanalysis, opens them up, and then everything opens up. And one of the most important things that opens up is the notion of instincts. Instead of instincts being biologically wired in to each individual, so that you have ages and stages of development in the way that psychologists would understand developmental psychology to work, and personality structures being laid down, and all of that kind of thing. Instead of that, you have instinct in its true Freudian sense as being operating on the border of the physiological and the psychical. And that opens up the question of how, at some level, the interpretative work that goes on as we make sense of our bodies changes how those bodies operate for us, and opens up all of the stuff that Freud talks about to cultural context, historical cultural context. It opens the way to thinking about the human subject not as a subject trapped by its biology and its relation to its oral stage, anal stage, phallic stage, whatever, latency stage, mature, the genital stage, oh, heaven. But instead of that, opens up the human subject as a subject in relation to language. And once you think of the human subject in relation to language, then you can start thinking about the political contexts in which psychoanalysis works, and think about how it is that when someone speaks, something of that cultural political context runs through them, flows through them, is reproduced, is replicated through them in their own interiority, in their own individuality. That's the stuff that that made Lacan attractive to me. Took a while because Lacan is not easy to read, and there weren't kind of books like Reading Écrit around. But once you could get into reading Lacan and discussing it, and that's crucial, and I make that clear in the book as well, that I had to do it through reading groups and struggle over what was going on in these weird texts. That once you get there to that idea, then you've got something which is more open and fluid and transformative, genuinely transformative. I think that's what hooked me into Lacan.
And you mean transformative here, not in the sense of transformative of the individual in the clinic, but you mean transformative in a broader, bigger sense?
Yes, but I mean both. I mean in the clinic, transformative in the clinic, because the individual subject in the clinic is not trapped into a normative kind of sexual development narrative, which many psychoanalysts, unfortunately, still adhere to implicitly, even if not explicitly. So I tell the story of when I went to one of the first conferences which really attempted to make a link between the individual work in the clinic and cultural political factors. It was a conference in 1987 in London called Psychoanalysis in the Public Sphere, organised among others by the historian of science, Marxist, libertarian Marxist, Bob Young. And that conference in 1987 was hit right there, right at the first conference, by the question of sexuality, because a book written by Noreen O'Connor and Joanna Ryan, called Wild Desires and Mistaken Identities, about lesbianism in psychoanalysis, had interviewed, what they had done, Noreen O'Connor and Joanna Ryan had done, was to interview psychoanalytic training candidates in the Institute of Psychoanalysis in London, that is the International Psychoanalytical Association's training franchise in London, and discovered that lesbians and gay men were being refused admission to the training. And worse than that, some lesbians and gay men had managed to get into the training by lying about their sexuality. And worse than that, they had to undergo psychoanalysis themselves as part of the training, as part of the deal. Go through psychoanalysis yourself, where the psychoanalyst, that is the training analyst, special kind of psychoanalysts that we Lacanians don't have. Okay, the training analyst reported to the committee, to the training committee, on the progress of the analyst, of the trainee. So what the fuck were they talking about in their analysis? Yeah? That they could get through it and eventually, when they were trained, come out as lesbian or gay.
So they were able to lie through the
Absolutely
analysis.
bizarre. So at this conference, Psychoanalysis in the Public Sphere, Joanna Ryan and Noreen O'Connor were there, and there were some guys there who were practitioners who were saying, well, you know, I've never met a lesbian or a gay man in the clinic. Come on, do you not know anything about polymorphous perversity or constitutional bisexuality or anything like that? You've not read Freud. So that conference was mainly organised around Kleinian and object relations frameworks. There were some group analysts hanging around as well. I wasn't a Lacanian then, I didn't know what it meant. Well, I just thought it was weird. I didn't know what it meant. That drove home to me how serious those problems were. I lost your question now.
Me too.
Yeah, okay, all right.
No, we were talking about, you know, why Lacan, why the Lacanian choice.
Yes. So then it made it clear to me that you needed a radical alternative to these approaches, and so when I did hit on Lacan, then it kind of I thought, okay, this is good stuff. This addresses these questions. That's the issue.
I mean, you're kind of alluding there in your anecdote to the minority status of Lacanians, and so, you know, it's much easier to find object relation theorists and Kleinians than Lacanians.
Yes.
It seems to me something has shifted. That Lacan has become bigger. There seem to be more people working on Lacan, writing about Lacan than 20, 30 years ago.
That is true. How many candidates do you think are training with the Institute of Psychoanalysis in London now? 8. There was a conference of the last Congress of the International Psychoanalytical Association in London earlier this year. Had a few thousand people. Do you know what the average age was? 75. Whereas the alternative organisations, not only the Centre for Freudian Analysis and Research, which is where I trained, has very large meetings. I went to a meeting of CFAR for trainees a couple of weekends ago. There were 60 people in the room. 60. And that's without going to the Guild of Psychotherapy or the Site for Contemporary Psychoanalysis or Arbors Association or the Philadelphia Association, who are sympathetic to Lacan and will include discussion of Lacan in their training. So yes, things have moved. Things have moved in terms of the visibility of Lacanian psychoanalysis in the clinical world, and things have moved in terms of the link between Lacanian psychoanalysis and the clinic. You know, when I started training the Centre for Freudian Analysis and Research, CFAR, we say. CFAR had been going a few years, but I think it was set up in like 1985, something like that. The image of Lacanian psychoanalysis among other practitioners was that Lacan was good for reading films and novels, but didn't have much to do with clinical practice. That has changed dramatically now. So we can talk about what goes on in the clinic as Lacanians without being seen as kind of weird and stepping into a world that we shouldn't have anything to do with. For a long time, the International Psychoanalytical Association in Britain, and it was an easier task for them because it was before the internet, for a long time they made it seem like anybody who was not trained in an international psychoanalytical association organization was not a psychoanalyst. And that the other kinds of psychoanalysis didn't exist. They maintained the fiction that it did not exist. Whereas in reality, about, I'd say just over half of psychoanalytic practitioners in the world today are Lacanian in one way or another. Some of them are in international psychoanalytical association organizations, undertaking a second analysis, setting up reading groups, changing their practice. They're not all outside in other organizations, but there's a diversity that now has to be acknowledged, which really changes the way that we discuss. So I went to the Psychoanalysis in the Public Sphere conference, which the first one was 1987. A journal was set up by Bob Young and other people called Free Associations, which had one or two Lacanian papers in it, but it was mainly Kleinian and object relations, and that was revived. There was a Free Associations conference in London. Where are we now? Are we in December now yet?
We are at the end of November.
Okay, like it was end of September. At the Freud Museum, and some of the usual suspects were there from the 1980s, but there were some Lacanians as well, and we weren't cold-shouldered in the same kind of way. It was interesting.
Why then? What's created that shift? Why is Lacan more available, more attractive, more embraced?
I think it's partly the energy and organisation of Lacanians in Britain who set up organisations like CFAR, like the London Society of the New Lacanian School, followers of Jacqueline Miller, Lacan's son-in-law, has his own distinctive reading of Lacan and Freud, but partly to do with that energy and organisation, supported by the international networks, and those international networks are easier to mobilise today with the internet. Okay, yes, but and I think that's one thing, and I think another reason is something that's happened in the realm of politics with the disappointments and the disappointments and the fracturing of the left through the 1970s and the 1980s, and the emergence within the left of a sustained feminist critique of the way that left organisations operate as quite macho, top-down hierarchical organisations. There has been a shift into therapy generally by people on the left and by feminist activists, and some of those old left activists and feminists and other activists in gay liberation movements, for example, have gone into. Some of them have gone into Kleinian analysis, some of them have gone into group analysis. Group analysis particularly attracts them because it's groupy. It's not just one-to-one in the clinic. And I talk in the book about how I encountered group analysis and how I eventually decided to go with Lacan rather than group analysis. But they've gone into those things, but I think that they've also particularly found Lacan attractive to them as a more politically congenial theoretical framework that will actually work with, that a slogan of socialist feminism from the 1970s, 1980s, that the personal is political, that will find a way of working in the clinic with these struggles around who we are, that is also embedded in cultural political questions. I think that's part of it as well.
Which is kind of curious, because Lacan himself was quite conservative and declares at one point, "I'm not a man of the left," and yet he seems to be embraced. Very much
the worst thing is Lacanians who try and be like Lacan. I mean, one was enough, and very useful was two, but he was pretty atrocious, arrogant, badly behaved character. I just posted on my Facebook page image of Dora Maar. You know, the surrealist. Dora Maar was lover of Pablo Picasso. Do you know Pablo Picasso was Lacan's personal physician? No, it's the other way around. No, you didn't know that. Lacan was Pablo Picasso's personal physician, because Lacan, of course, was medically trained, medically qualified, trained as a psychiatrist, but was also a doctor. And so he was Picasso's doctor. Picasso once said, when he was asked about this, that he preferred to have kind of professionals around him who were incompetent in their fields of expertise, and that's why he had Lacan as his doctor. But Dora Maar, who was a lover of Picasso, how can we put it? Was extremely distressed and disturbed, and so Picasso got his friend, the psychiatrist, to section her. That was Lacan. Once a psychiatrist, always a psychiatrist, I say. There's a real danger, and I do go through it in this book. I have one enemy, which is psychology, and the way that psychologists try and turn psychoanalysis back into psychology again, and I have another enemy, which is psychiatry, which is even more dangerous, which medicalizes psychoanalysis and turns it back into psychiatry. Another one, psychotherapy, we could talk about later maybe. But that I think it indicates that whatever advantages there are and opportunities in Lacan's work, we have to do some work to get at it, and we have to be careful not to idealize Lacan as a figure and recognize that he was a man of his time, and he wanted to be a big knob, and behaved like it as well.
So we need to read Lacan in the way that Lacan advocated. We read Freud, we go back and we work with the text. We don't just assume the text is somehow transparent.
Yes.
So you touch on politics there, and it leads me to my next question. Psychoanalysis is a practice, and you've talked a lot about that, it being about the clinic and the work between the analyst and the analysand. And you're talking about this regeneration or growth of Lacanians, people using Lacan, writing about Lacan. A lot of that has been outside the clinic, people using Lacan's ideas to talk about film, literature, and particularly politics, I think, in the last 20 years, since, particularly since Zizek, I think. Is that a legitimate use of psychoanalysis? Is psychoanalysis a practice about the clinic, and any other use of psychoanalysis is a metaphorical use of psychoanalysis?
Yes. Yes, I think it is. I think I'd hedge that around with other reasons why we might take psychoanalysis seriously in the cultural political realm. But I think basically that would be my answer. I think the phenomena that Freud and Lacan are concerned with are clinical phenomena. They're concerned with what happens in the clinic as someone speaks to another in a way that is very strange, very, very strange rules of engagement, as someone tries to follow the fundamental technical rule of psychoanalysis, free association, Free association is impossible. They discover why they can't free associate. They notice the blockages and the hesitations and the circumlocutions and so on. Repetitions, hesitations. They notice that. And they do that in the presence of someone who says very little, who won't tell them what their dreams mean, and they find that very frustrating, won't give them advice, won't reassure them. All of the basic rules of interaction are broken in the clinic, and I think it's in that really weird setting that psychoanalysis works. And I think that's where psychoanalysis is applicable. I don't think it's applicable outside the clinic. But psychoanalytic ideas have suffused culture today so that we do think of ourselves as having unconscious, think about the meanings of our dreams, think about the relationship between our childhood and our adult behaviour. Recently in the election there was this candidate. I can't remember which party it was. I think it was Labour Party actually in Gordon, in Aberdeenshire, was knocked out of the running because they they made a critical statement about the nature of the Israeli state, saying that the Israelis were treating Palestinians badly because Israelis were like abused children who then become abusers when they're grown up. Okay, now it's not classical psychoanalysis, but it's suffused with some notion of what happens when an individual or a group is subjected to a certain kind of experience. I don't want to get into whether they were right or not to make that parallel, to make that diagnosis, but it does show something about the emergence within culture of these psychoanalytic notions. And I think given that has emerged in the past how long? 50, maybe a little more years, there has emerged something we could call psychoanalytic subjectivity, where people do kind of relate to each other and topicalize psychoanalytic phenomena. And I think to that extent, then there's space for some kind of analysis of the way that language operates to configure relationships and to help people reflect on the way that they're using that language. Mm-hmm. It doesn't mean that you're interpreting what people are doing as really being about these processes, the manifestation of these underlying processes inside each of them, but it is about attending to the language that they use as being structured in some way by these resources, these theoretical resources.
So the cultural effect of psychoanalysis legitimizes the use of psychoanalysis to understand the culture?
Yes, in some kind of way, yes.
Could you not make exactly the same argument about psychology?
Yes, you could. Yes, you could.
It struck me reading it.
Yeah. Except psychology fixes people in place and tells them how they should be. Psychoanalysis unravels.
Oh no, I'm not suggesting the same thing.
But the same does apply. Yes, but it's more pernicious and more dangerous in the case of psychology, I would say, and psychiatry for that matter. A number of psychiatric labels that we throw around in our everyday account. Someone's got their hand up.
So you mentioned psychotherapy.
Yes.
Also as with psychology and with psychiatry.
Yes.
I was interested
My problem with psychotherapy is that psychotherapy relies on the notion that you can connect your thoughts with your feelings and in some way overcome the gap between those two things, which I think is fundamentally wrong. And psychotherapy then also operates on the assumption that there can be some kind of empathetic communication between the therapist and the patient, which will become the basis of the healing experience. So that as the therapist understands the patient, and the patient appreciates that they're being understood, that facilitates the linking of thinking and feeling and facilitates the cure. And I think that is fundamentally wrong as well. I think that it leads to a view of social relationships as, not immediately, but I think it happens again and again and again when psychotherapists think about their place in communities and in society. It leads to a notion that people should be communicating with each other and that we can understand what each other mean, and that is the basis of harmonious relationships, family relationships, community, building of communities, even at some level of national communities. And I think it is fundamentally mistaken. Not only is it fundamentally mistaken, but it sutures or it stitches over or it covers over the conflicts and contradictions that there are between what we say and what we would want to say if we could say everything. Let's put it like that. That it sutures over that gap, irremediable gap between conscious and unconscious, and that irremediable gap between us and others as we try to make sense of what they're saying to us, that those contradictions. So I would come at it the other way, and I would say what is primary is not intuitive understanding that we then need to arrive at again, which is the basis of psychotherapy, but rather what is primary is misunderstanding, miscommunication, conflict and contradiction, which runs through the symbolic, the big main register, one of the registers that Lacan talks about, the symbolic structuring of our lives, the symbolic register, this stuff, all these words and all this image of this room and all of this stuff that holds us in place, and helps us to understand how the second register, the level of the imaginary, that is of communication, which is necessary as we're talking to each other. Okay, I wouldn't want a Lacanian world where we say we don't understand each other and we wouldn't be able to go shopping or do anything. Okay, or have this kind of conversation. There's a kind of necessary illusion in our communication with each other where we make a bet that we're conveying something to the other person, but it helps us to understand this kind of Lacanian idea of contradiction and disjunction and contradiction, disconnection. It helps us to understand how that imaginary level of communication, of intuitive understanding, is illusory, patches things together, and makes us better able to appreciate the operation of the third register that Lacan describes, which is the real, symbolic, imaginary, and the real as the stuff that cannot be symbolizable but keeps hitting us, either through the kind of horrific chance, incomprehensible things that happen to each of us in our lives, or in living in a world, incomprehensible, chaotic world. Yeah. Yes. We're opening up now, aren't we?
We are.
Yeah. Okay.
You mentioned two interesting words during your conversation and explication: concealment and retrieval. And what you've just been talking about reminds me of Martin Heidegger, his notion of the end of philosophy and the retrieval of thinking. He claimed that philosophy has been covered over. Real philosophy, which is thinking, by analytic philosophy, philosophy of language and that kind of thing. So his aim was to deconstruct philosophy as such and retrieve thinking. And from what you were saying just now in response to the question, are you talking about the end of psychoanalysis and the retrieval of what? Psychoanalysis? In another words?
I don't know. I don't know whether it would be a retrieval of something, but I think we certainly have to have on the horizon of our thinking the possibility of the end of psychoanalysis. And I think if we're to think in any way about the historical constitution of psychoanalysis as a theory and practice, we'd have to be open to the idea that it's not going to continue forever, that it's embedded in a certain set of social relationships. So that kind of like goes with the territory of Lacanian psychoanalysis, I think, that we're open to that idea. Lacan says a number of different places. He refuses to say that Freud discovered the unconscious and prefers to say that Freud invented the unconscious. I think it's very useful in drawing attention to the appearance of psychoanalysis at a certain historical moment. So I would bracket out, if I can say that, the question of retrieval, because the danger of speaking about retrieving something, and it's a danger that we can see in Heidegger with his idealization of a certain kind of community and relation to nature, that also, as Zizek points out, has some consequences for Heidegger's attraction to National Socialism. That I would say that rather than attempting to retrieve something, we put that aside and we are more open to what might happen that is unexpected. If we speak of retrieving something, there's always a danger that we will model what we think we're retrieving on existing forms of ideology that are kind of potent within the culture that we have here with us at the moment. That's the Heidegger problem, I think.
A further point about, you said about once a psychiatrist, always a psychiatrist.
I'm not a psychiatrist, eh?
But I worked I worked in the field for 40 years. You would know that Lacan's MD thesis, his examiners described it as the best account, the best sensitive account of understanding of mental illness.
Yes.
So, when he sectioned, the lady,
yeah.
I mean, was he exercising power, or was he a caring doctor concerned about this person in danger of decompensating, to use a psychiatric terminology?
I think it was an abuse of power to lock someone up in a mental hospital. I think is an abuse of power. The ethics of psychoanalysis should be an ethics of desire and contradiction and acceptance of the difference between the ways in which different subjects in the world try to find their way through it. And I think confining some people to mental hospitals is not in keeping with that. Lacan might well have produced a very good psychiatric thesis, and he also gives a very useful critique of the ego as being what he calls the mental illness of man. But I think we have to read that in the way that we read many of Lacan's phrases, words and phrases, and diagnoses, as inframed by a certain kind of language that he was also trying to escape. That is to say, the mental illness of man is to adopt a medical framing, to draw attention to something about the paranoid nature of the ego, just in the same way as to say it's the mental illness of man immediately cuts out half of the population, or women. But he's caught in a language that he's trying to kind of work his way out of. In the same way as I think at moments he tried to work his way out of the problem of psychiatry. It's there still, I think, in the way that some Lacanians remain fixated on a kind of tripartite clinical categorization of the patients that they see in the clinic as either being neurotic, psychotic, or perverse. But I would see those clinical structures as useful in the clinic and only in the clinic, and more to help the psychoanalyst to get their bearings than as diagnoses that can meaningfully be made in a psychiatric way. And there are Lacanians, and I arrive at them at the end, towards the end of the book, around Jean Alouche in France, that refer to this tripartite category system, psychosis, neurosis, and perversion, as the Ponepsy complex, which is like part of the psi complex, something that we need to get out of as well, you know.
Last point.
Yes.
I was drawn to your final chapter content, transference, ethics in action. Say a bit more about that.
I think that we're faced in this very strange little situation in the clinic with a kind of relationship that enables something to appear in the way that people repeat patterns of relating to another. That is, they repeat signifiers that position the analyst as being significant figure or significant figures, many different significant figures from their life, and the psychoanalyst needs to know how to orient themselves in relation to those signifiers in order to draw attention to certain repeated signifiers. That's transference. That's working in the transference. And everything that the psychoanalyst says in the clinic will be heard within the transference. Every interpretation that the psychoanalyst makes will be heard as coming from that figure that is fantasized by the analysand, by the patient. That's why the psychoanalyst should be extremely careful about the interpretations that they make. Avoiding interpretations that posit themselves as revealing an underlying truth or in any way making a moral or evaluative comment about behavior or thinking. The analysand, for the Lacanian psychoanalyst, particularly the analysand, we call them the analysand because they're the one who analyzes. They're the one who interprets, and the task of the analyst is to allow the analysand to work their way through that very difficult, intense personal relationship with their analyst and to find a way out of it as well. Relive the things that they're speaking about in relation to this person, which in the most peculiar way that rarely happens in other parts of our lives, involves the relationship that they're speaking out about being the stuff of the talk as well. They're embedded in what they're talking about, reliving it, re-experiencing it. But as psychoanalysis proceeds, they learn to get themselves out of it as well. And I think that's why, maybe this is where the ethics in action comes in. In the final chapter, actually, I'm talking about the context of the clinic in the immediate surround of the area that I work in. That as they work their way through it, this is maybe the reason why so many psychoanalyses end badly. Most of the psychoanalyses that I've been involved in as a patient analysant and as a psychoanalyst don't end well. Why is that? I think it's because most times people come to the point where they get sick of it. They get sick of it and they realise they don't need it. And that's when the analysis is over. Yeah, I won't say we're going to meet for 3 years and then like, Joe, it's nearly 3 years now. How are you feeling? You know, bring it neatly to a close. It ends on points of conflict and contradiction, even to the point, I would say, that it's possible where someone might go through an analysis and decide at the end of the analysis that it was a complete waste of time, that they didn't learn anything, that they changed maybe in a way that would have happened anyway, and they don't need it. That's good analysis.
It reminds me when I worked with young people many years ago in a psychoanalytic unit. And I remember that the young people would abandon us rather than work through to leaving.
Yes.
They had enough.
Yeah.
And we saw that as a strength.
Yes, and the consolation that we have as Lacanians, of course, is this afterwardsness or Nachträglichkeit is always there in our imagination. We imagine, oh well, maybe in 25 years' time, they'll look back and they'll think, yeah, it was good. Glad you did that.
Well, we used to say that the young people got better despite our best.
Yes.
I rather like that.
Yeah, it's good. That's really
good.
Cool.
Resources.
Yes, I like that. Yeah.
I've got a question, or like, which other approach, I don't want to say psychotherapy because you sort of question this psychotherapy approach, you close to, if not Lacanian psychoanalysis. I don't know if I expressed my question well. Like what other, for healing, like if for healing human being, which other approach you are the closest to, if not Lacanian psychoanalysis?
Revolutionary Marxism. That is a different domain of practice. And I think that there are many ways. I'm not an evangelist for psychoanalysis. See? There are many ways that people can make use of relationships that they construct around them, and it could be through politics, or it could be through encounter groups of some kind, or it could be through spiritual practices. I was raised as an atheist, so I kind of find this a very difficult thing to say, but okay, yes, I recognise this as well. There are many ways that people find a way of getting through difficult things that are happening to them and finding a way of making sense of how they got there so they don't repeat those things again. It doesn't have to be psychoanalysis. It is one of the practices that I'm committed to and I know something about, but I wouldn't say that it's for everybody. I would say that psychotherapy is good for some people, it's really nice, it's helpful, why not? CBT, cognitive behavioural therapy, conducted by a psychologist, can be really useful on occasions. If someone is really in a bad straits, then why not some medication, as long as they know what the medication is doing, have the choice to come on the medication and come off it again, able to share information about what the effects are and the side effects of the medication, why not? Yeah, there are many different ways that we can that we can change, address who we are and change. Yeah.
Hi Ian, lovely talk, enjoying it so much. I'm wondering about a sort of contemporary, modern, democratic psychoanalysis that somehow might turn up in and work in ordinary places like universities and schools and communities, that's less elitist and less sort of silo-based than where you started your talk. And just, I wonder if you're hopeful for that, or what you might have to say about psychoanalysis as a praxis that turns up in that more democratic way in this crazy world.
Yeah.
That might actually really benefit from it, you know?
Yeah, yeah. I think it comes through in a number of different initiatives, like glimmers of hope. One is the formation of the Free Psychotherapy Network. A couple of years ago, we had the founding conference in Manchester, and it brings together practitioners who want to revive. Here's the question of going back to our history and retrieving something again. Reviving the free clinics that operated in Berlin and Budapest and Vienna in the 1920s. There's a wonderful book by Elizabeth Danto called Freud's Free Clinics, which is about this. We often think of psychoanalysis as being something you have to pay for. No, it's not true. It's not true. And particularly people in private practice, what they like to call independent practice, make a fetish about the payment. It was necessary, to facilitate the transference. Actually, many of the psychoanalysts in the 1920s, early 1930s, around Freud, paid subscriptions to their organizations, and that money went to pay for free clinics for people, poor people, working class people, people in communities who didn't have access to those services. Freud gave a speech in Budapest, I think it was 1918, it was at the time of one of the attempts to set up a commune in Hungary, in Budapest, where they were setting up effectively a welfare service, a national health service. Freud said psychoanalysis should be free, should be part of this. And Wilhelm Reich, of course, was involved in this kind of thing, but he had the full support of Freud. And we can see in Elizabeth Danto's book that there are little chits signed by psychoanalysts, including by Freud himself. If they didn't have space in their own clinic, then they would write a chit. The patient would take it to another psychoanalyst, and Freud or whoever who had signed the chit would reimburse the money. Pay that psychoanalyst. So the Free Psychotherapy Network has been trying to revive some of that work. Not only psychoanalysts, other kinds of psychotherapists are involved in it as well, and many of those psychotherapists and psychoanalysts, I should say, have also been involved in protests outside the Department of Work and Pensions offices against the use of psychotherapy to discipline people and make them be good citizens and apply for jobs and that kind of thing. So there's a political element in the work that they're doing as well. That's one thing. Another example is in Brazil. I discuss in the book the clinical margins clinicus, the clinics of the margins are places that operate in favelas. And are working with poor people. They'll just rock up in a beach or a square and they'll have a chair and they'll say, okay, where's psychoanalysts? Who wants to come and talk to us? Yeah? So there are attempts to do that. And there have been a third thing, I would say, and this is why I was so attracted to group analysis for a while, and there are Lacanian group analysts, is in group analysis. Although the founder of group analysis, S.H. Fuchs, although the founder of group analysis, Fuchs, talked about ego training in action. Ah, dear, a dead one. They're very clear, the group analysts, that the aim of a group is not to make an organisation function more efficiently. Very, very clear about that, and their interventions in organisations have been taking place in industrial organisations and in higher education institutions as well, to reflect on the way that these crazy institutions operate to divide us from each other. And yeah, so that would be another thing. So there are glimmers of hope here. Yeah, I'm with you. We need this. We need this.
Need it. I mean, the glimmers of hope are great, and I remain optimistic. And
yeah, I am optimistic.
They are glimmers.
Yeah.
For example, I work in a low-cost setting clinic in Leith, where people can access for very, very little money, or actually free at a point of delivery.
Yeah.
And yet it's so rare, and the waiting list currently is, I think, 4 months. So there are reasons to be less than optimistic also. I think it's CPCT in Paris.
CPCT. Yes.
They do really,
these are Millerians.
really
yes.
easy access,
good stuff.
short-term bit of
Absolutely.
work, you know?
Absolutely.
It's really interested in it working, and yet
Yes.
there's a lot of evidence that psychoanalysis remains marginal, that it remains elitist, that its ability to pay is maybe the most single important indicator in whether you can access it, which is really unethical.
Unethical. I mean, I mentioned Jacques Miller earlier, kind of like, he was Lacan's son-in-law, as if he's a bad guy. But around Miller, there have been really interesting initiatives that have, like the CPCTs, that have engaged with communities and provide low-cost clinics. Yes, really, really good, really, really good stuff.
I've seen people in coffee shops and parks over the years since I retired from therapy. So, by the way, the Danto book hinted that in Red Vienna, during that blossoming time, Freud may well have been a socialist. Phaedon was definitely. But Freud was like a closet communist.
Well, you know, when he
supported a lot of
yes and no. You know, he was, he said, he was asked what will happen when there's been a revolution, and he said, what do you think about the idea, there'll be 100 years, of kind of misery and hardship, and then there'll be thousands of years of peace and happiness. He said, it's got about half right. He says, first half. He was really quite cynical, sceptical, but maybe justifiably so. I'd say it was if I had to, in a very sectarian way, categorise him, I'd say he was a social democrat. Which isn't a bad thing today, is it?
Where are they?
Well, as a Jew, you had to be smart at that time, though, anti-Semitism.
Yes.
You had to be smart and be under the radar.
Yes. Sure, absolutely. I should also say, just to clarify, that the Free Psychotherapy Network is also actively involved in supporting the development of psychotherapy in the NHS. It does not set itself up as a counter to the NHS or as part of the insidious dismantling of the NHS that's been going on.
And is this a nationwide organisation?
Yes, it's very small network, and many of the people involved have got more involved in the campaigns against the DWP and so on. But they still link with each other. There's a website, and people can see a register of psychoanalysts and psychotherapists who will give free or low-cost treatments. Yes, still goes. Yeah.
The thing is, I think it's Jacques Miller, but there's a line. It's something like psychoanalysis is a praxis. It's a kind of suffering, a kind of complaint. The psychoanalysis is rooted in suffering.
Yes.
And we don't have to look very far, culturally and contemporary now, to find suffering.
Yeah.
And psychoanalysis is such a role there. And yet again, I'm repeating myself, but the point needs to be made over and over again. That, the need is deep, and yet the provision is quite rare.
Yeah, absolutely.
Those two things don't
Yes.
meet very well.
Yes.
So scope for some fertility and growth for me, hopefully. Yeah.
Yes. Yes. And to be alive to the different ways that is developing, and to learn from the different ways that it's developing in different parts of the world. That you know, I made the joke about, you know, becoming international and then splitting, but I think there is something fundamental in psychoanalysis, at the heart of psychoanalysis. Yes, that it's concerned with suffering, but it's an internationalist practice. It's internationalist at its core. Doesn't mean it's universalizing and everyone is the same, but it's internationalist.
And I think that's something that, in my experience, the Lacanian community does better than any other school of psychoanalysis in terms of being international, being connected, communicating, and the transmission of a teaching on a global scale. I've had good experience in that anyway. You look unconvinced.
Well, you know, there's the International Psychoanalytical Association,
Yeah,
was set to be in 1910. Psychoanalysis has always been a diasporic movement, a movement of international, you know, kind of circling around the globe and remaining in contact, and group analysis as well. It does the same thing. Jungians, yeah, I would say no, it's not only Lacanians do that actually. Yeah. Did you have your hand up?
I did, I don't.
Oh, you, both of you.
Go on, you go.
Yeah, so how do I convert Calum Neill to the Labour Party? But my real question is...
There's a deeper problem that we just cannot solve.
My real question is are liberals clinically perverse? Is that a thing?
Say it again.
Are liberals clinically perverse?
No, they're not.
That's what Matthew Flisfeder says, who's a Lacanian.
Yeah, Lacanians say some reductive, nihilistic things, as long as with the other kinds of psychoanalysis. And I think, actually, if I was living in Scotland, I wouldn't necessarily vote for the Labour Party. Just put that on the table.
Just back on, I'm at the very beginning of a research journey. My topic is ethical literacy in school-age children in Scotland, and I'm thinking about the explanatory potential in Lacan around ethics, the ethics of psychoanalysis. I haven't read Seminar 7, I've started it. I wonder what cautions you would give in terms of bringing or trying to bring or including a Lacanian critique of existing teaching and learning in Scottish schools, Christian, Kantian, utilitarian. Is there potential, in your view, to try to bring a Lacanian critique of ethical teaching and learning? And if so, what cautions you would give me at the very beginning of this journey?
Well, I think it's so good at the critique, actually. I think Lacan is so good, and the later Lacanians are so good at unravelling the dominant ethical systems that are around, that tells you that you should aim for some kind of utilitarian kind of distribution of rights and distribution of suffering, in a way, commodified. Or that there is a good that you should aim for, or there are certain kind of ethical injunctions that you should follow. That's what Lacan does so well, that critique. I think the questions that Lacan asks in Seminar 7, for example, where he asks, you know, have you given ground relative to your desire, shouldn't be read as an injunction that you should therefore follow your desire. That's not what he's asking. He's asking a question, and it's the questioning that I think is at the heart of Lacanian psychoanalysis that could be useful in this kind of project that you're describing as well, with the caution that it's not the ethical framework that you're adopting isn't turned into a grid itself that will then demand certain kinds of responses and normalise certain kinds of behaviour. That's my worry. That would be my concern. And we don't have to go Lacan. We can go back to Freud. That Freud was very clear that psychoanalysis is not a worldview. It's not a system of thought that you can apply to anything and everything. He says the closest that psychoanalysis comes to a worldview is to the worldview of science. But even there, he's saying it's the closest it comes. He's still warning, this is Freud, it's not a worldview. And an ethical worldview is something that turns ethics into morals and morality. And I think that's sounds like that's what you would be up against in this kind of project, that slippage from ethics to morality all the time. From ethics as a puzzling and thinking through about what we're doing, as opposed to a system of moral rules which tells you how you should speak.
And that aspect of engaging with other people, and I'm asking how could Lacanian theory, and in particular his ethical theory, inform ethics or moral thinking at that very practical level? That's what I'm wondering. I'm at the beginning and I'm learning, and in fact Lacan is only 9 months old for me. I've only been looking and reading him for 9 months. But in fact it was Calum's book that levered me firmly into it. But that link between my desire and my behaviour, do you think that is something that Lacan can expound on?
Well, I think one way that it does come in that is useful is in thinking about your own position as a researcher, that you're part of everything that you describe in these schools and with people that you might interview or people that you might describe, that you're part of this, and you give a particular picture of what's going on because of where you're coming from. So that kind of reflexive, subjective element is there in the work that you're doing. Lacan says somewhere, resistance. When we talk about resistance in the clinic, and psychoanalysts can say, "Oh well, they resisted this interpretation, and the patient was very resistant." And Lacan says, "No, resistance is on the side of the analyst. If they do something strange, act out, don't come back. You have to think, what have you done? What's your place in this? What's your role in this? How have you been part of this?" So I think that kind of what we would sometimes in qualitative research refer to as reflexivity is something that can be deepened and intensified in a Lacanian approach to these questions. Which kind of like brings me back to the book again, which is that's why I wanted to say where I'm coming from in giving this story about what psychoanalysis is. And it's not an abstract, neutral, objective account. It's one account. From here, where I am.
Which is a perfect way to end. Thank you very much to